Mm, sorry. You wonder why I keep bringing up those marbles, right? Okay, let's move on with our discussion about genre, and we're going to give some a little more specific definitions and give some examples of some movies, right? So here we have that list from before, and I think I'm going to add in one more. I think I have war also added here. So we have action, adventure, comedy, crime, and gangster, drama, fantasy, horror, mystery, romance, thriller, and western. And I believe I'm going to talk about war as well. So uh, for action movies, typically action movies are going to be male dominant. So most of the time, there are these days. I mean, there are more and more action movies where women are the protagonists, where they're the main characters. But it's not the common one, right? It's men, and they have high impact, they have high energy, they have lots of physical stunts, and it's continually moving. That's what action means. It's moving, moving, moving. There are fights, there are car chases, there are big battles, there are rescues, there are races, there are all these things. Maybe it's martial arts, maybe it's climbing some mountain or hiking or going through some swimming through some river, crossing some river or something. But there are always these things that are going on, and it's escapism, right? That while you're watching this movie, these events are just unfolding so quickly and so intensely as they go along that you are just caught up in watching that. And we said that one of the purposes of watching film is to escape, and that's true whether it's drama or romance or whatever. But in action movies, this is the method. The method of allowing the viewer to escape is through the action that's going on there, right? So the protagonist is usually male, and we have these kind of uh, archetypes of the action hero. And remember, I mentioned before that sometimes actors who often appear in action movies are seen differently, sometimes not as well, not thought of as well as actors who appear in particular in dramas, right? So I'm a serious actor, right? So uh, we're getting a little less and less of that today because a lot of actors want to move into lots of different genres, partly to prove that and partly just for the interest, right? But male action heroes like James Bond movies, all of the 007, right, movies would be uh, basically action movies where you have a male hero. Most of the time, action movies have a static protagonist, right? So it's not about them changing as they go. So the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, that's also action. So we have four protagonists along with Splinter, their leader. So it's this nonstop action that's going through there. Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, John Woo film, right? So those movies are basic. Now there are elements of other things within some of those movies, but for the most part, those are action movies. So that's the first one. Then we have adventure. So adventure movies, usually we can see these kind of paired together with action. And if you go into the movie section on Netflix or Amazon or even a real video store in a real DVD rental place, right? You'll often see action adventure is kind of one section, uh, even called action adventure. So they usually take place in exotic locales, so some special kinds of places, deserts, oceans, islands, and there's some treasure hunting and this kind of thing that's happening. So it could be that, but it also would include things like pirate movies. That's adventure, right? Because it's happening in this fun kind of interesting place. So that's kind of the difference between action and adventure, is that to go on an adventure means to go someplace, right? So to have an adventure means to go someplace a little bit different. So that would include Pirates of the Caribbean, that kind of movie, right? So that's what adventure movies would entail and include. Not exactly completely separate from, there will be action within adventure movies, but it's a little more paced, right? So adventure is a little bit different. Then we have comedy, and of course comedy is about laughs, but the content is also not about something serious, right? So we don't get a lot of cancer comedy movies. Maybe there is a subgenre of comedy called dark comedy. Maybe the best example I can think of is Prizzi's Honor from several years ago. It's a kind of this cross between a gangster movie and a comedy, and it's about a man who's a hitman and a woman who's a hit woman, a killer, hired killers, and it's really this dark humor. But comedy is mostly meant to be light, right? And again, that's that escapism. That's its purpose, and if it meets that purpose, then it can be successful, right? So it has to be something we can laugh about, right? So usually these are built also on normal situations where they exaggerate them, where it might be the normal situation is exaggerated, or the language is exaggerated. There may be action, but that action also will be exaggerated. It will be bigger, and it'll be silly and funny, and instead of just fighting, maybe Jackie Chan does a lot of this, where in his action he tries to include comedy, but it's still an action movie because it's about the action. So if there is a fight, then the fight is funny, right? The man falls down or gets hit with a pie. That's the difference between just action and comedy, right? So the relationships are bigger and more things are important and being exaggerated and are impacted by them, and the characters too. You're going to see these characters that are these kind of overgrown. There's no understated characters in comedies. Then next up we have the crime gangster. Generally, there are crime dramas which are very popular today, especially television dramas, but not in film. It's not generally separated, but crime and gangsters, and we kind of understand what that's going to be about. It's going to be about mobsters, and usually it's bank robbers or even street gangs, gang members, that thing, and people who are mostly law breakers. They're operating outside the law. Now, that doesn't always mean that the protagonist is the policeman, because that's not always the case, because sometimes the crime members, the criminals, are the protagonist. And that does happen as well, as gangsters can be the protagonist. And sometimes that's that reversal, right? We'll have the police, but generally that's what they're about. So like movies that are about famous criminals like Al Capone or Bonnie and Clyde, those are crime gangster movies. But also movies, those in both of those instances, Bonnie and Clyde and Al Capone, they are the main characters, but they are basically they're the antagonist, right? So the policeman trying to capture them becomes the protagonist. That's the hero of the story. Whereas in a movie like The Godfather is a crime gangster genre film, and even though they're kind of bad guys, they kill people, they operate outside the law, they break the law for their living. They are considered the protagonists because they're the heroes of those stories. But this also would include some courtroom movies and legal movies too, where it's about a law case or a lawyer and that kind of thing. And so crime gangsters sometimes include legal thrillers as well. Drama is kind of the upper level. It's what's considered to be, this is the goal. This is what everybody's sort of kind of trying to attain. If you want to be a really good actor, you have to be a dramatic actor, because these stories are serious, and it's not about the action. right? Or how tough someone is, or how far he can jump, or any of those kinds of things. It's about the story itself. It's about how the story is developing. It's about even things that where it takes place. Where it takes place is lifelike. It has to resemble real life. So it's even if a space drama, it would have to be something where they've tried to emulate the things that we already know to be true about space, and then it could still be called drama. But basically, drama means it's not about the special effects and the fighting and all of those things. It's about the story. It's about the dialogue. It's about the character and the character's journey, their personal journey, their emotional journey through this story. Now, some classic examples for that would be like James Dean, like Rebel Without a Cause. Classic To Kill a Mockingbird would also fit that category. It's not uncommon, especially in that time period, right up until the 1950s, 1960s, for those kinds of movies to come from literary works, because literary works were essentially drama, because it's about the character, it's not about the action. Right? So there are a lot of those, but a movie like Shawshank Redemption, which is a really, really popular movie, would be drama, because there is action, there are fights, people get killed in that movie, but it's not about that. It's about the personal growth, the journey that each of those main characters goes on as they go through the story of the movie. So Shawshank Redemption, also Fight Club, Brad Pitt movie Fight Club would basically be drama, even though the title even says Fight Club. It sounds like, well, it's all about action. And there is fighting, but that's not what the movie is about. Fighting is just something that happens in the movie. It's not what the movie is about. The movie is about those characters dealing with who they really are. And so that makes it drama. And that's what makes it kind of interesting too. If it was all just about the fighting, it would be a very, very different kind of story. Okay, so main focus is on the main character and that main character's development and that main character's interaction with either the other characters or his sometimes just his environment, maybe his workplace or where he's living, right? So that's drama. Then we have fantasy. Fantastic, right? Fantastic themes. We have to say that fantasy means it's something that could not be real, right? It could not be real. That's what fantasy is about. So we use this expression otherworldly. So these themes like woo, magic, right? And maybe mythology or folklore. Folklore, those stories, even folklore that's based on historical facts, like King Arthur or Robin Hood. And these stories, they're real people that the key element, the core element of that story is based on some real person, and then that story's been kind of exaggerated and told over time until it's become folklore and become sort of magical, right? Those are still fantasy. So maybe for us, of course, Harry Potter's probably our best example of that. That's completely fantasy. It's a different world. It's using magic. It's all of those kind of things. Has supernatural events. There's future telling. There's flying. There's all of these other elements. There's transforming of people into different shapes and those things. So even though in many ways it functions like a regular drama, because it is about Harry and about his growth, right? But the elements that they take place in makes that fantasy. Okay, so let me have one more drink from my Marvel cup. Also, Princess Mononoke would be considered a fantasy. So we could use a Japanese movie example for that too, right? Then we have horror movies. Everybody gets that one, right? So horror movies, we're scared, right? Um, the audience has to have that adrenaline, that fear factor, right? So it's not like Toy Story 3 whenever they're sliding down towards the fire and we're afraid they're going to die. We're afraid for them, right? Horror movies make us afraid. What's happening there will happen to us. That's the difference, right? So we can be scared for a character, worried for a character. That doesn't make it horror. When what's happening in the movie, in the film, makes us afraid for ourselves, that makes it horror. So whenever you see movies like Friday the 13th, right, or Nightmare on Elm Street, those kinds of movies make us afraid that it could happen to us. Classic examples, Dracula or Frankenstein's monster, those, and again, those come from classic novels, right? So from literature. But those stories are horror stories because they make us afraid. And the other thing is that the ending is usually something surprising, something shocking, right? So Jason doesn't die, Freddy never dies, right? So most of the time in horror movies, there's that indication that whatever the horror is, it's not quite finished, right? So because of that, we have that little bit of fear part still inside of us. And that's how we judge whether it is a horror movie, and then that's also how we can evaluate whether it is a successful horror movie. So we enjoy watching that. There are lots of reasons people enjoy horror movies. They're very popular, right? Because we talked about this early on, is that one of the reasons we watch films is to feel things. And whether it's funny or love, or even sometimes we watch them to share that sadness, right? So it's, it's okay to watch a movie for that purpose. And the thing about watching horror movies is it feels good to your body, even though you're afraid. It gets your heart rate up, your blood is really moving, right? And you get all charged up from that. So, and it also causes us to think about stuff that we wouldn't normally think about. So that's how we can evaluate whether or not it's really a horror movie. Of course, we're afraid that someone's going to die or someone's going to fall off the building or something, but that's different. We're afraid for that character. We're not afraid for ourselves. When the movie makes us afraid for ourselves, that makes it horror. All right. Then we have mystery. What's a mystery? Good question. Mysteries are something's happened, and now someone is trying to figure out why it happened, maybe how it happened, but mostly it's who did it. If we know who did it, then the mystery will be about how it was done or why. And we have those early Sherlock Holmes movies. Now, the more recent Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmes films are much closer to action, much closer toward action than pure mystery. But still at its core, it's still about solving the mystery, solving the case, solving the problem, right? So that's what makes it a mystery. If the main theme is that it's about trying to work out some problem, then that's going to make it a mystery. So all of the way through, you have to not know what's going on. There recently, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6, I think 2014, the movie Gone Girl with Ben Affleck is a really good example of this, where it feels like drama, but it's mystery, because all through the movie, you as the audience, also the main character, doesn't understand what happened or how it happened or why it happened until the very end. And at the end, there's a really big kind of reveal, right? So that makes it mystery. And so that's one of our other genres. Then we get to romance. Lots of movies have romantic elements, right? Have romance elements where there's the what the generic or the always included love story. We said that before about like Star Wars. There are 2 or 3 different romances that are occurring throughout the series of Star Wars. But for it to actually be a romance story, then they have to have these 2 main elements at their core. And one is that the central story is the love story. It's the romance. So we said before, like, is Titanic disaster? Is that a disaster movie or is that a romance movie? Maybe it's a romance that happens in a disaster because it's the main core, but it doesn't end well, right? Because, spoiler alert, Jack dies. So that's not very satisfying emotionally at the end. Now, we could argue that Jack had to die, that it's not very realistic or a fulfilling, or it's just kind of a cookie cutter kind of story. If they get away together in the end, right? So happy, right? So that's happy ever after, HEA here, right? Right here are HEA. This is basically, this is the typical ending for romance, is happy ever after, right? So Cinderella meets the prince at the ball, and in the end he comes and he finds her and he marries her and they live happy ever after. And then we have this other one, which is happy for now. So lots of serial stories that continue on is that, well, up until now, okay, the relationship is solid and we've made some progress and we've made some commitment for now. So maybe Bridget Jones' Diary, maybe those kind of fall into that category. So in the end, it's not decided that they're going to live together happily ever after, right, for forever, but they are going to be able to be happy at this moment. And that's why I like a story like Romeo and Juliet. Well, it's a famous love story. No, it's a tragedy because it ends badly, right? And it's not about their love, it's about how that love doesn't work, right? So a romance, the central part of it's the love story, but the ending has to be emotionally satisfying. So while we might argue that, because I'm often comparing Romeo and Juliet to the Titanic, they're very similar stories. Only Jack dies, right? Only Jack dies. So if only Jack dies, then it's not as unsatisfying as Romeo and Juliet, where they both die. And in some ways, there's this idea too that Romeo and Juliet, they both die, so they're actually still together because they died together. But it's not very emotionally satisfying, right? So that takes that romance out of it. Most of the time, the stories are a little bit lighter than this kind of thing, right? So oftentimes, romances are seen as unrealistic or maybe too optimistic, right? Because in the end, we expect to have this more happy ending, right? So happy ever after, happily ever after, or at least, at the very, very least, happy for now. And then we have the thriller. The thriller is a little bit different than horror or action or adventure, because in the thriller, there is something happening. Sometimes disaster thriller, we mentioned that as a subgenre before, is that something is happening and the hero has to escape from whatever this is that's about to happen. And the audience feels that tension, feels that pressure for the protagonist, for the hero of the story, and that's what makes it a thriller, right? So sometimes it's just called suspense, but suspense, I'm not sure that's being used nearly as much these days as just thriller. So Alfred Hitchcock movies, most of them would be considered thrillers. because there's this mystery kind of element, but they don't always solve the mystery. And because they don't always solve the mystery, then the mystery isn't the thing. The whole feeling of that anticipation of waiting for what's going to happen next is what the key element of the story is. So Hitchcock movies like Vertigo or Rear Window would be pretty good examples for that. So main thing is that you have this heightened feeling of kind of anticipation of what's going to happen. And then we had war. War movies are about real war. So like Star Wars is not a war movie at its core because it's not a real war, right? But war movies are usually not about one war, but usually about one battle or one period or one event that takes place during what would have been historically a real war. So some famous ones: Full Metal Jacket, Apocalypse Now, of course Pearl Harbor, or The Guns of Navarone. They're war movies, and usually it's about the soldiers' lives, what they have to do to make something happen during some big event, and usually that's some big battle, and usually the movie ends with that big battle. Right? So it's not action because it's not just all about that keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. But it's taking place during wartime, and it's about the war. So there are some movies that take place during wartime that aren't war movies, where that's just a subplot or a different part of it. So war movies would generally be about a real war that took place. Then we have Westerns. Now, Westerns are the classic American film genre, and they've gone through lots of different kinds of changes. And the hero is this very kind of static. Usually the protagonist, the main character, is a very static, stoic, very tough, good fighting person. And there's often a little bit of a romance kind of element to it, but it's about that time. Well, what is that, about 1860 to the late 1880s, not quite to 1900, right? Where during the cowboy era, during the settling of the western frontier states, the western frontier areas of America, right? So maybe it's cowboys and Indians, maybe it's just about trappers, that kind of thing, that are traveling through that area. But it's about gun battles and men being tough and men being men, and that hard life, and trying to overcome usually one particular big obstacle. And that obstacle might be the antagonist, right? So their main rival they might be battling with, or it might be a big drought or a big battle with Indians or something along those lines. But mostly Westerns are just the stories that take place in that setting. But they do tend to follow the same kind of strict formulaic characters, where you have this hero. He doesn't want to be the hero, and then he's forced to be the hero, and then he wins the battle, and usually he gets the girl, right? So that's basic story, and it happens in the West on horseback. So keep in mind, these aren't something that we chiseled out in stone, but there's just some kind of general guidelines for us to use. So we have some place for us to be able to say, okay, this film is like this film, or this film is not like this film because this is what separates them, or this is what brings them together, more than two movies that are set in the same time or in the same place or have the same, even same story, right? You can have the same story told using two different genres. Dracula, for example, we talked about before. Dracula is a horror story. There have been attempts to make Dracula more of a romance, right? So, or a failed romance. So it's not about those things. So we need to be able to have these kind of guidelines, at least some general things for us, so that we can have some talking points for comparing things. And so just like the characters that we talked about, we've talked about characters before. They could have the ability to fit into lots of different areas, but at their core there has to be one major genre that defines them, and then the others are just kind of subparts for them, just like for individuals and for character types that we have talked about before. So there you have it. There's a fairly brief discussion about genre, and then hopefully we'll be able to move on and we can start to begin to compare some films based on what we now know about plot, about structure, about characters and character types, and now about genre.